Good morning, Amanda. Just checking to make sure you can hear us. Good morning.
She might be muted.
Yeah, she is connected, but I'm not sure if she has the audio pin. So for those of you who can hear us, we're doing a quick test, making sure our volume is okay and that everything is okay. Is with us. Hi, Amanda.
Hi, Roland. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am. You sound great.
Okay, great.
Well, I'm glad to know that Washington County wasn't washed away in that rain. I know that you all had some pretty.
It was a close one. It was pretty close. Yeah. We had to get the paddle boats out. I
have some cousins, and I'm from Nelson County, and I have a cousin that lives in Boston, and of course he lives up on the hill, luckily, but they flooded out pretty good.
Boston is horrible.
A small town at the turn of the century when they needed access to water, but it's not a good place now.
No, it's sure not. I had it out last week to make sure I had it for today, and it's been buried since. So I'm digging to find it. Are there other schools that are joining us today, or is it just me? Where did that go? Roland, are you there?
Yes, ma'am, I'm here. I had myself muted.
Oh, okay. I wanted to make sure I hadn't lost you on my end.
No, you haven't.
Okay.
Hi, Carla. I sent you your audio pin. I don't know if you can hear us, Carla, but if you can, if you would go through the process of entering your audio pin. Again, I'll resend that to you. Okay. Great. Eric, hopefully you can hear us. And we're going to get started in just 1 minute. Good morning, Eric.
Good morning. How are you?
Doing great. I'm going to be a little nosy. What district are you with?
Grave County.
Oh,
Grave
awesome,
County High
awesome.
School.
Are you there with Carla?
With who?
Carla Whitus.
No, I'm at Grave County High School.
Oh, okay. Oh, great. Great. There's Carla. All right.
Here I am. I was trying to get a headset, and somebody swapped it, so I'm on my phone instead.
Well, we had a couple other people who were coming in and out, but we're going to go ahead and get started because we want to make sure that we were. Carla, I think you've got multiple sounds.
Oh, do I? Well,
Yes,
I've got it on speaker. I'll take it off speaker. Is it better now?
Actually, if you want to, if you just do, if you mute your computer,
Okay.
you can leave it on speaker if that's easier for you. It's not the speaker phone as much as it is the sound coming out of the computer and the phone.
Okay. Is it better now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Okay. I'm
All
going
right.
to turn it on speaker. All right.
Okay, let her introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Deborah Walker, and I'm President and CEO of CTL, and we've been partners with Gear Up Kentucky for about 12 years.
Yeah.
Through numerous rounds of walkthroughs and other kinds of work. So welcome this morning. Glad to have you here.
Good morning.
We have a relatively small group, so I want you all to introduce yourselves, to say just hello and what schools you're with. Amanda, we'll start with you, and then go to Carla, and then go to Eric.
Okay, this is Amanda Mattingly and Jackie Russell, guidance counselor, and we're with North Washington Elementary School. We're a preschool through 8th grade school in Washington County.
Carla?
All right. My name is Carla Whitus. I'm assistant superintendent at secondary instruction at Graves County Schools, and we have two schools in the Gear Up grant with Graves County Middle School and Graves County High School.
Thank you, Carla. And Eric?
My name's Eric Keaton. I'm with Grave County High School. I'm assistant principal here. This makes my second year. I've also worked with the Gear Up program at Portland Middle School, which is another middle school in our district. We do have two middle schools. I think both of them are involved in the Gear Up as well.
Great. Well, thank you all for joining us. Got somebody.
Echoing us.
Carla, I'm going to mute you for a while, so that way when it's time to talk and share, I'll make sure I unmute you, Carla. But again, I think you're getting some sound feedback through your. I don't think it's the conference call as much as it is the computer. If you muted the sound, the microphone on the computer may not have been muted, but we can work with that. Anyway, it's not going to be a whole lot of us doing a lot of talking. I'll do a little bit of background information, but really it's going to be about having you all go through your reports looking for some patterns. And what we're doing is prepping for the Sustainability Summit that's coming up on the 16th. And again, we'll present a little bit of data at that time and some key findings that we have, but this is really about an opportunity for you all to look at your report, ask some specific questions that you all have as you all are looking at it, and for us to get a little bit more specific feedback for you. So the small audience today is really a nice way for us to have a little bit more specific feedback that we can offer. Okay, so we'll talk a little bit about the process of the walkthroughs, and then the majority of the time, and I think it's going to, I timed it out to be about an hour and 15. It shouldn't go past that, for you all to look through your report, begin the interpretation of your report, and sharing some of those findings. What are some of the key things that you're finding that connect to work you're already doing with your teachers in school, and things that you say, well, this confirms what we already knew, and even in some cases, you may have some questions. And what we want to do then is how do we triangulate what we saw with what you're finding and add more value to that. One of the things that we always ask schools to do is to use data to make decisions and never use just one data source. We recognize the reports are one piece of data, and you all have access to tons and tons of data. What we want to do is say, okay, some outside observers come in, relatively objective point of view on what they're looking for. It's definitely quantified, and we'll talk a little bit about that as we go today. And this is what they saw when they were in my building. We can't dismiss that because it is what we saw. You sometimes schools say, well, but that doesn't necessarily fit with, it was a one-day snapshot. Yes, it is a one-day snapshot, but it is the instruction that was observed in the building on that day. And so we want to make sure that we're taking it for what it is, a one-day snapshot, but also making sure that we respect that it was an objective point of view of what was seen in the building.
So one of the questions you want to ask yourself is this representative of instruction in my building or buildings, Carla, for you since you're a district person, and what other kinds of data do we have that says that this is representative or that on another day we might have seen something else. And one of the values of these reports is you have another set of trained eyes in the building, or more than set, to give you some feedback, and that's leading you to
hearing your voice, because we do have some muting. We want to encourage you to use the chat box whenever you have a question. That's a great opportunity for us to make sure we stop and hear you all. We don't have those nonverbal cues like we have when we're face-to-face, and so we can make sure we stop then. So anytime you have a question, please type in the chat box either what the question is or say, hey, can you stop for a second? I have a question about this, and that'll be my cue to make sure that we're recognizing the audience. There will be times where we do that intentionally, and we'll put you on the spot a little bit, especially with such a small group, to think about what are some of the things you're finding from your report. But we also want to make sure that we're answering your questions as we go along. And that brings us to our first question for you all. So we're going to test this chat box option, and we want to think about what are some needs to knows. So what are some of the things that you want to take out of this next hour of your life that help you with this upcoming process, that help you understand the report, next steps with the report, how to use this with your faculty. So I'm going to give you about a minute and a half. I'll do the same thing with you all I used to do with my students. I'm going to give you 97 seconds to type in a couple of the things that you would like to take out of the next hour. Okay. So I don't have anything typed in the chat boxes. Do you all know how to use the chat box? Yeah. So again, on your GoToMeeting, there should be an option down at the bottom that says chat. If you click on that and then click on the little box, you should be able to type in a couple of things for us. And again, things that you're looking for to get out of the next hour. I'm going to, okay, thank you. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay. Thanks, Carla. All right, well, I will continue to use my wait time, and we'll make sure, Carla, we try to make sure that we're addressing your concern, but we also want to make sure that we're hearing from you all as we go forward. So let's talk about the walkthrough purposes, and it was, again, to collect data about what college and career readiness looks like in the buildings, and it's the instruction to help students be ready for the kinds of rigors that it takes to be college ready, and research says you can't wait until high school to start that. The earlier you start that process, which is why Gear Up starts at the 7th grade to begin with, the better off we are. So we looked at that aspect of it. And then it's also, because we know the observation data is one piece, we try to triangulate suite, which is one of those, it is the test that about those benchmark numbers all the time. And those benchmark numbers are the numbers that it takes minimally to get into college. These often become our goals, and really that is the bottom threshold that students in those college level courses. So a little bit of what the walkthrough process looked like for us. It was 52 middle and high schools. Now we started the middle schools in March of last year. Actually, I think it was late February, a couple of the schools. And we carried through December of 2014. So all of the data was collected during 2014, but the middle school data was collected during the 2013-14 school year, and the high school data was collected during the 2014-15 school year. There were 1,361 total classroom observations. That's a pretty significant amount of data. And as we look at the data, we'll recognize that at any one school, it's a snapshot of what instruction looks like on a daily basis and what it looked like on that day. But as you look at 1,300 plus observations that totaled over 400 hours of instructional time, it gives us a pretty good indication of what instruction looks like in the Gear Up project, across the project pretty extensively.
And it's also important to know, I mean, you're interested in your school report, but we also report aggregate data, not individual school, but aggregate data to the project for Gear Up's own evaluation that they do with the Department of Ed. So from their perspective, having almost 1,400 classroom observations gives kind of a substantial view of where the project is. And of course, we're comparing not only on your school report with a couple of years ago, but this also gives the Gear Up project a sense of, are they making progress?
So when we were in the buildings, what we were striving to do is see all teachers at least once and all core academic courses. Along with looking at all core academic courses, we were looking for different designations: honors, comprehensive, pre-AP, even to a certain extent, as much as we could, collab classrooms. We weren't able to always get into all collab classrooms, but we did try to see those if they were evident on the schedules that we received and if time allowed. So we were always looking for as wide a range of instruction that might be observed in a building as possible. We have a soft cap of 3 observations per teacher. We tried not to see teachers more than that if we could help it, but in some of the schools it wasn't an option. They were, you know, in fact we were in a couple of schools where they had 1 or 2 teacher departments, so you were going to see one teacher more than 3 times. But if a teacher was teaching 4 courses, we would not necessarily see them 4 times because of the opportunity to skew data. The goal was between 15 and 20-minute observations, and if you look down below that, you'll see what we actually averaged out to. Reading and the social studies averaged a little bit over 18. The reading and writing standards that were observed in the ELA classrooms actually averaged over 20 minutes. So for that, we actually ended up seeing a little bit over 23 minutes of instructional time. Math was 15, 57, and science was the lowest. And that is because if you were in a classroom and there were no lab experiences going on or nothing that was tied to the lab experiences, then the ACT college readiness standards for science were not going to be observed, so it was an easier observation for the observers to make, which means they were keeping close to that 15-minute timeline.
And then they were looking at the reading standards.
In social studies.
The literacy anchor standards.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, yeah. Okay, so what were the things that we were looking for? They were looking at the ACT college readiness standards, and again, these are the standards that ACT has put forth, and they designed their suite of assessments around. And I don't know if everybody is aware of this, but the ACT revised those standards late August of this year. So you'll notice in the middle school reports, as we begin to look at those, look slightly different than the high school reports. There were some new standards added and some standards were dropped. We chose in our evaluation not to drop any standards for this go-around so we would have comparative data, but we did add any new standards that were added during the August revision. So in the high school report, as we get there, you'll see some gray boxes in the 2012 data, but that's because those were the standards that were added in the August revision. The middle school won't have that because they were observed in the spring of last year, and the standards were not yet observed, not yet revised. I'm sorry. As we did in 2012, we looked at the rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework, and we'll look at that as we do our first set of exploration of the data, learning, and the kinds of learning that need to be in place for students to be thinking at that higher level that they'll need in college. That was one of the frameworks that we did in both sets of observations. We did pick up this time some key literacy anchor standards from the Common Core. Common Core had just been released when we did the 2011-2012 walkthrough. And you'll hear me reference 2011 or 2012. The walkthroughs were done during that time, but the reports came out in 2012, so that's generally what we use for our name there. We did not feel it was fair to the teachers to begin collecting data on those standards when they had just been introduced, and this is not an evaluative process. This really is a data gathering process and a way to help schools think about what they're doing to prepare their students for college success. So we did add that now for this walkthrough. We don't have comparative data, but we do have project level data that we were looking at. So just to give you an idea of how well instruction in the building is correlating to the Common Core. Another reason why we picked up those literacy standards is that they tie in very nicely with the Professional Growth and Effectiveness System, Domain 3. As you begin to look at the Domain 3, I believe it's B or C, it's the questioning and discussion techniques, and those literacy and how you have students talking, reading, writing, speaking, listening about the content. So that was another nice connection that we were able to make as we looked at the narratives, and that's something we'll talk about later. We had observers do overall classroom and overall school pattern observations. That was the qualitative piece of the data that they were collecting, and you'll notice that those narratives are written in the reports as well. And then last but certainly not least, from our perspective, we strive to help schools look holistically at what college readiness looks like. We're going to focus on instruction for the most part, but we also recognize that there's a lot more that goes into building a college-going culture in a school, and the school performance guide, the rubric for assessing college-going culture in your building, is an important piece for us because it helps us think about holistically how are we addressing this. It's not just instruction. We know there's those non-cognitive skills. We know there's parent engagement. We know there's how do you help students build aspiration and support all those kinds of structures. So we did a self-evaluation this time to see how schools were progressing as we run through the project. Any questions so far that you want us to make sure we're addressing?
On that second, need to know, I'm not sure who that's from. Our 6th grade is not in the middle school. We're playing catch up with Explore suggestions. We do see that, and we'll be talking about that near the end of the webinar. We do have some follow-up activities that Gear Up has us doing that will pair middle and high school principals regionally to do some kinds of walkthrough observations and debriefing with us, and that will be one strategy that can help make that connection. What we'll probably need to do is, if you have 6th grade in the elementary schools, involve elementary principals in your feeder school in that process. And we can give you some other suggestions as well. Just want to acknowledge that we saw that.
Okay. And Eric, we also saw yours, ways to keep that, continue to implement the Europe curriculum in your buildings. And we think that's a really important piece as we progress forward. And just to make sure we understand, and this is a good example of how it looks different. At North Washington Elementary School, where Amanda is, they're a K-8 school. And even though Gear Up starts at the 7th grade, we're able to work with the 6th grade teachers because they're in the same building. But Carla, as you point out, your 6th grade is not at the middle school in Graves County. Therefore, we're not able to go to a different building to work with 6th grade teachers. So that's one of the caveats that the feds allow. They allow us to work with those 6th grade teachers if they're in the building, but you can't back the project up if they're not. Okay, here we want to look at real quickly percent of students making benchmark in the project. This is project level data and not individual school level data. We want to acknowledge something right off the bat. We know the accountability system in Kentucky is very heavy on testing. I mean, that is something that is debated all over the country right now, and we're not here to debate that, and we want to acknowledge something. If you look at the 2011-12 data and we look at the 2013-14 data, we do see growth, and we want to recognize that. We also need to recognize that these students are not the Gear Up students. The 2011-12 juniors were well ahead of the project level, and the 2013-14 juniors were the year ahead of the cohort. So this is not, so really these are apples and oranges, but we do want to acknowledge the trends. Students in your schools are scoring more effectively on the ACT at the junior level by about an average of 4 or 5 points, and that is a worthy goal. We don't, as we said before, we want to make sure we understand something. The goal is for students to be successful in college, and this just means we're getting more students at that minimal level of benchmarking. Again, it's a positive trend, and we want to make sure that we're acknowledging that. Even in science, which is not benchmarked in the state of Kentucky, there is an overall mean score gain, which is a positive trend as well. So I do want to jump immediately to the rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework as we begin looking at that ACT. So this is Bob Daggett's work. It is Bill Daggett, I'm sorry. I got his name confused. And this is when you begin looking at that A category is the recall level of knowledge. B is where we begin to look at application level of knowledge. C is the assimilation level of knowledge. And D is that highest level of knowledge, and that's that adaptation. And so as we look at the data we were collecting in our rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework, we were not collecting data on the recall. All learning minimally has to be at the recall level. So we didn't, what we need to know is how are students progressing beyond that. And we used a 4-point scale. 0 means it's not observed, 1 means minimal evidence, 2 means moderate evidence, and 3 meant strong evidence of observation. And to give you an idea of how we correlated those numbers, I'm going to go back to that connection to professional growth and effectiveness system that we talked about earlier. If you look at those accomplished level practices in PGIS and those exemplary level practices in PGIS, the moderate evidence of rigor, relevance, and differentiation would correlate to that accomplished. And again, what that means is teacher-directed for the most part, strong routines or patterns in place, teachers asking a lot of questions, but teachers being the mediating factor as opposed to being more student-centered. 3, that strong evidence would correlate more to that exemplary category in PGIS, and that is where students are talking to each other in high levels, teachers are asking more global questions, and students are responding to each other and to as well as to the teacher, but the teacher is not necessarily the mediating factor. The students are the mediating factor, and the teacher is more of a facilitator. So that's, as we begin to look at these numbers, that's what we're looking at. 1 then, as we back our way down, would be something is missing out of 2, or something is missing out of 3. It might be student-centered, but the routines were not necessarily there to be as effective as it could be. Or it could be teacher-directed and the routines were not very strong, or the questions weren't very strong, but they were at least asking some questions and allowing students to respond.
Or the students were generally doing worksheets, which had some questions that enabled the kids to apply what they were learning, but it wasn't strong enough to rise to level 2.
So as we begin to look at this other data, and this is where we want you all to begin looking at your reports. So as you look at your reports, the reports are structured a little bit differently. High schools tend to be much more departmentalized, so the reports have sections that are an overall section and then department sections, math, science, ELA, and social studies. The middle schools have a range of how they are structured. So we chose to kind of put things in just kind of groupings, so that so the principals could work with the teachers either at the grade level or at the department level, because it really depends on how big the school is and how we see those things. But if you look about page 5 or 6 of your report, you should be able to see your rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework. And it should look something like this. Something like this chart. But I want to go back for just a second and talk about rigor comparison from 2012 to 2015. One way to look at that chart is to say, what has happened in our schools over the last 3 years? And if you look at the project level data, 2012 is the blue bar, 2015 is the red bar. It is a little bit concerning that the application assimilation data has dropped, and application has dropped pretty significantly. Adaptation level stayed, from a research perspective, exactly the same. Relevance of the materials did gain, and we have a couple of theories about that and philosophies about that. And assessment, looking beyond recall, dipped. Not enough to be statistically significant, but it did dip. The drop in application and assimilation level thinking is a major concern from the project perspective. Again, for students to be thinking about higher level applications of learning and being able to make the connections between the discrete skills they're learning, we need to see more of that. So that was a major concern. The relevance of materials, honestly, we feel like that is tied directly to a lot of the computer programs that we saw that were student-centered, that were, again, from a relevance to the students' learning, they were targeted to students mastering indicators that they've been lacking in. So that probably had a huge impact on that data. So as we begin looking, we want you to begin thinking about what your data looks like. Now let's look at the differentiation comparisons. And high standards for all students to achieve high-level learning took a dip. Range of materials took a dip, which is why we think the programs, the computer programs, were likely the cause of the earlier gain in relevance of materials. It wasn't that more materials were being brought in. It's that actually fewer materials were being brought in, but the materials that were being brought in were more targeted. Flexible timing seemed to be taking a rise, and again, that correlates to a lot of the computer programming that we saw where students are working at their own pace. In the classroom, scaffolding to achieve high levels of learning took a dip, and demonstrations of learning took a dip. That really kind of flatlined. Can't say a whole lot about that. Scaffolding is that whole idea of the gradual release process, and we think there may be some concerns about teachers being able to handle that RTI structure and being able to release more effectively classroom instruction. So that's an area that we are kind of monitoring very closely. It looks like we have another comment from Eric. Does the overall data that you have analyzed indicate that teachers are slowly moving towards student-driven classrooms? Eric, that is the million-dollar question, and thank you for asking that question. That is the question we're going to put back to you momentarily, and as we go forth. But that is the million-dollar question. Thank you for asking that. And again, I'm not going to dance around it, but we'll come back to that later. So here's one of the things that we observed a lot of, and I put this slide in there. This is our only real key findings that we're going to share today, that we're going to push you on the anecdotal evidence. We have literally about 1,000 pictures of worksheets. We saw a lot of growth of students working in the worksheet arena independently during this last round of walkthroughs, and that's a concern for us. And if you remember back to the rigor application and assimilation levels that were dropping, it's because we saw a lot more multiple choice worksheets and routine practice worksheets that students were working in. So that's my one editorial slide for the morning. But I want you to go through and look at your rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework. Hopefully everybody's going to be on that slide, and I want you to look for some patterns. So I've identified from this school a couple patterns that I want to acknowledge. One of the things that we want to look for is there may be some growth. If you look at the 2012 data and the 2014 data in social studies that I've highlighted here at the application, assimilation, and adaptation levels, this school has significant growth. 1.5 to 1.6 is not significant, but it is, at least it's holding its own and gaining some. However, a 0.8, which is below minimal level average to above minimal level average, is a very healthy, statistically significant gain. It's a small population that we're looking from here, only 4 observations, but that is from 4 or 5 observations, but that's still a nice gain. And then the adaptation level, moving from 0.5 to 1.2, is a huge gain. Also looking at that range, if you've got an average of 1.6 and you have a range of 1 to 2, that means you've got more 2s than you do 1s. For the 1.2, you go from 0 to 2, you probably got a lot of 2s, and there's a 0 in there. It means you've got something that's lacking there. So as you begin to look at that, that's something to think about. Also, jumping over to the math in that same category, pretty consistent gains at the application and assimilation, not at the adaptation level in this case, but the assimilation and adaptation both gained. So we want to begin thinking about, okay, I saw some patterns here, I saw some gains. What are some of the causes that we might apply there? Could it be a curriculum? Could it be professional development work? Could it be a new teacher? Could it be an increased focus by the school on rigor?
So as you're looking at this chart, you can see of each content area, you have the project average first, which gives you some sense for your school. How do you measure up to other schools in the project? And then you have your scores. Where you would like to be for all of these is somewhere between 2 and 3, somewhere between 2.0 and 3.0. Okay, so sometimes it's easy to look at this and go, oh, good, we've got 1.8 and the project's only got, 1.0, but that's still less than moderate. So as you're looking through, you want to highlight, where are your areas of strength, where did you think you would be stronger and you're not, keeping in mind that 2 is moderate level evidence. How much time do you want to?
All right, so I'm going to be quiet and give you all about 4 minutes here. And again, what I'd like you to think about is I'd like you to identify 3 patterns that you observe. They could be growth. They could be places where there wasn't growth. Like if you look at this chart again, the science department actually kind of regressed pretty aggressively compared to what happened. So you're looking for patterns that are positives or possibly, in this case, also not positives. Looking for patterns that fit your data that you already know. Again, you do a lot of walkthroughs in your building. You do a lot of observations in your building. So what are things that we're correlating, confirming for you as well? And then thinking about how you can use this data. Beginning to think about that. And what I would like you to do as you get done sharing is to share out one thing that you found. And so we're going to be quiet for the next 4 minutes, give you a chance to look at your rigor, relevance, and differentiation data very specifically, and ask that you share one of your findings. If you have any more questions, please feel free to type them in, or this is a good opportunity if you want to ask a question. Amanda, yes, they do. I believe it's on page 4. Have you been able to find that chart? Now, the charts that I use with project level data are not in there. You all have the charts that look like the table of values. It's too hard for us to generate individual charts in these reports. Amanda, I think I was muted. I did respond to your question, but I don't think you all heard me. You've got about a minute and a half left. We are not able to generate those graphs in the reports. They take up a lot more memory in the process, and so because the reports are so big, we're not able to generate those charts. That is project level data. Your all's charts are the table of values. So I would like you, as you begin finishing looking at your rigor, relevance, and differentiation data, to share at least one finding, positive, negative, opportunity for growth, or something that confirms your walkthrough data. Carla, you're in an interesting situation where you can compare the middle and high school data as well. Our 4 minutes is up, and I'm going to give you about 30 more seconds. If you could, type in one key finding you're finding from the rigor, relevance, and differentiation framework. If you'd prefer to share it with audio, we'd be happy to unmute you, or you can unmute yourself. So I'm going to unmute you, Carla. I'm not getting anything from you all. I just want to make sure that everybody is able to hear us. And one of the things that we're asking is that you all look at your rigor, relevance, and differentiation and find a pattern and share that pattern either in the chat box or audio. Carla, I'm going to unmute you.
Muted. Hello.
Hi,
Can
Carla.
you hear me?
Hi, Carla. Yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
It really looks like to me that it's probably just what you show pictures of. There's too much of the worksheets and multiple choice, and we probably know that, but it's staring us there in the face, and there's not enough application of knowledge, making students think, problem solve, those types of things that, again, I think the testing that we give, we fall victim to it, and we shouldn't.
One of the things that we want to point out is, yeah, I think that's good feedback, Carla, that the application level questions can be achieved, but we often see the routine problem sets. But if you look at the ACT on the science and even a lot of the reading, they're looking at higher level inferencing. So working with our faculty to how do we don't back away and shy away from those kinds of questions is something that is worthwhile. Amanda, will you share something you found as you looked at your data?
Well, I'm sorry. I tried to type it in, and it looks like it didn't go through. Overall, our English and social studies went down from 2012 to 2014. And in our math and science, we seem to increase, even though we're nowhere near where we need to be. And I think that is our math and science. We did place a focus in that because we were so we were at a pretty scary level, especially in math, with how our kids were performing. So I was excited to see that that did increase some, but we still have a long way to go, of course. So, you know, nothing really surprising. I think that the rigor and relevance across the board is an area where we have to hit, and we've taken this even since this walkthrough in 2014. It led a lot of what our CSIP addressed this year in regards to the rigor and relevance aspects. So hopefully if another walkthrough were to be done, we would see another, you know, increase in those areas. But
great. Thank you so much. And I think your follow-up and how that influenced your CSIP and how your professional development is a model that a lot of schools could learn from, Amanda. Thank you. Eric, will you share something that you were able to find about Greene County?
Basically, what I noticed was our flexible time in all areas, in all the areas are concerned. Yeah, we've seen some positive growth in the science area towards the rigor, relevance, and differentiation. And what we've done with the report is we went back and walked through the report and took some of our deficiencies and met with our PLCs and come up with an action plan on how we can address those deficiencies in the classroom. And then what we've done is looked at some of the activities that we can utilize in the classroom. We've put some time frames on it as well so that we could make plans for it in our lesson plans. So we've sort of taken the report and got an action plan for every subject area.
Great. One of the things I'll ask as we begin to look more specifically at some of the department data is what are some of those specific action items that you all were putting forth for the departments. But that's, again, another nice specific response to the report.
Well, basically, one of the things that we did was we're having our teachers look at our ACT standards and correlating them with the Common Core because we want to make sure that those are aligned, because I think we were missing a lot of areas in the ACT standards. So we had them go back and really look at their standards, get them aligned, and address those issues. Another thing that we wanted to address was the rigor in the classroom. You know, of course, that's something always that we're looking at. You know, in the differentiation models that we're utilizing. You know, we have some different programs in our math department that we utilize, but at the same time, how are we doing it every day in the classroom? You know, we have computer programs and things of that nature, but how are we doing it on the day-to-day lesson plans?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so looking at the next section, and this is, I think, an underrated piece of data to use with your schools. As we look at the literacy anchor standards and the reading, close reading, and speaking and listening, these are not all of the anchor standards, but they are a selection of standards that we feel are good leverage points for schools to consider. So real quickly, thinking about reading, it's in the middle here, and that is the idea, are they doing informational reading in the classrooms? Are they doing literary reading, likely in the ELA classrooms, possibly in some of the social studies classrooms, and how they're using strategies to address those readings. And those are more general approaches to reading. And when we think about reading in the science classroom, it's not necessarily reading a paragraph. As we look at reading in the science classrooms and even in the social studies classrooms, it's about reading data as well. Are they able to read a table of values? Are they able to read a graph? And do they know how to read left to right, right to left, up and down? So there's a lot of different ways of reading those data analysis pieces and that informational kind of reading that you do in science and social studies classrooms. And so that looks considerably different. But there's also a lot of overlap. And one of the things that we know as students begin looking at generalizing strategies across classrooms is that if there is some correlation or connection between the strategies they're using in one classroom and the strategies they use in another, they're able to generalize the process and adapt it more easily to the new content. So we think that this set of information that you have, and it doesn't look exactly like this, but it is the next section after the rigor relevance framework, is a really important piece for leaders and administrators as you begin thinking about instruction in your building holistically. Close reading, as you look here, is something I want to kind of begin to look at because, again, it's one of those areas that is not talked about a lot, but it's kind of really critical analysis and synthesis kind of strategies that we need to be looking at. As expected, the ELA department is addressing it more. There's more evidence of the ELA addressing it than there is in the science and social studies. That would be expected because not only are they teaching the content, they are generally teaching the process. And again, as I mentioned earlier, close reading in an ELA classroom is likely going to be something where they are taking an individual word or an individual sentence and seeing how it impacts the sentence or how it impacts a paragraph. And so they might, in a poem, for instance, taking a short phrase and reading it and then rereading it and trying to figure out why the author chose the specific language that they chose to put that in. In social studies classroom, that might be they are taking a specific quote from somebody and saying, what's the significance of this quote? Or in a primary source material where they're looking at turn-of-the-century cartoons. Excuse me. The close reading on a turn-of-the-century political cartoon might be, what are some of the characteristics that you notice in this cartoon? Why is it that there is a donkey in this cartoon? You know, what's the significance of the donkey? Or what's the significance of the donkey being in 4 inches of mud or 4 feet of mud and not being able to move? So something like that where they're really kind of delving in, not just looking holistically at the cartoon or whatever it is they're reading, but delving into a specific component. And obviously in science, that might be looking at a table of values and looking at the change from one from 1 minute to the next minute, specifically focusing in on how that change might differ from the other changes. So thinking about what that looks like, and I want to draw your attention to, again, present and exemplary, and what this means from our perspective. Present means the standard was being addressed. So this idea of students given multiple opportunities to read a piece of text. It's not just that they were working on reading a section in a book and then answering questions about it, but that they were tasked with reading a section in the book and the teacher specifically drew them back to that section for something. So there was some discussion going on. So there's that opportunity to reread the text for a specific purpose. Or they were, again, as I mentioned, looking at some data analysis. But looking at the exemplary. And the exemplary practices, again, correlate to that exemplary category of practices at the professional growth and effectiveness system. Student-centered, students taking advantage of the opportunity to use those kinds of things, students not being guided to look at, but students being asked to look at and read a specific section, and them bringing up the idea of, well, if you look at the table of values here, you see how this one changes. It's different. And that kind of instruction would be the exemplary category. And I want you to look at those numbers because it is a little bit telling. I mean, the highest category we see in any of the exemplaries is 14%, and that's students citing evidence about what the text is saying. And that's a standard that you see across ACT College Readiness Standards as well as the Common Core. So we're glad to see that teachers, especially in the ELA department, are really grabbing onto that. But all students should be citing evidence from the text whenever they're engaged in discussion. So there's a couple things involved here. One, we didn't see a lot of discussion, and two, that intentional opportunity to have students citing evidence is something that, those are two specifics that you can begin working on with your departments. As you look at that last category, that really is also the issue of students prepare for academic dialogue by studying text and citing evidence. That correlates to what I just mentioned. And so the social studies was doing a nice job of that. 40% present, that means you're doing it well. Not a lot of student-centered approaches there, but at least you were doing that in the social studies department, which was a positive for us. Where we begin to really drop off is students presenting ideas from the reading and diverse media. Those numbers drop off in the ELA and science components. Math is, not that we left math out of this, math has a different set of standards. They are not responsible for the literacy anchor standards in mathematics, but they are responsible for the standards for mathematical practice, and we did also look at those practices, 4 of the standards for mathematical practice, and definitely that actually correlated very nicely to the standard you're looking at here. So what I'm going to do now is be quiet and ask that you look here and identify something that connects to what you already know about your departments. So as you look at this data, find something that connects with what you already find in your walkthroughs that you perform, and what's a strategy you're doing to increase these. I'm going to give you 2 minutes to kind of really think about what's one thing that you see that correlates and what strategy you all are using to develop these standards. Okay, so that's about 1.5 minutes, and I apologize. GoToMeeting has updated their interface, and your all's chats did actually come through. I didn't see them, so I was looking for a different layout than what they used to have. So I apologize. If you all want to type in one thing you found, or again, we can do it. We can just have everybody share. And Eric, I'll start with you this time. So that's been about 2.5 minutes. We're ready anytime. Anybody want to share first? This is dangerous when you're in a okay, go ahead, Amanda.
Okay. One of the things that we've really tried to find a way to make happen is using our ELA teachers to pull and guide our social studies and science teachers. And we've done that through developing LDC in our social studies and science classrooms and trying to find a way to, in a meaningful way, incorporate these Common Core literacy standards into the science and social studies classrooms, because those teachers meet it with a lot of hesitancy that they don't have time to teach that. And so trying to find a way to make it relevant and really meaningful to their content has been the way that we're trying to approach that. And the work that our ELA teachers have done with those teachers through the LDC modules has been really beneficial for us.
I think the LDC, because those LDC structures do have a lot of higher level thinking in them, and they do prompt teachers to ask those higher level questions. I know that we did a lot of literacy work at the middle and high school when Striving Readers many years ago, and that we weren't in North Washington, but have you all had the science and social studies teachers to work with the ELA teachers to identify specific strategies they might incorporate in their classrooms to get at the kinds of thinking that those teachers are concerned about, So for instance, again, if I'm a science teacher and I want students to be able to analyze data, to really kind of work with some people to think about what are some of the strategies I can do, I can incorporate that are flexible enough to be used in multiple departments.
For example, academic dialogue, making sure that students are asking questions, advancing ideas, debating amongst themselves, so that it isn't just coming from the teacher. Otherwise, if they're just being told, they're not going to really internalize and have the ability to do their own analysis. It's interesting when science and social studies teachers say, we don't have time to teach literacy, when in fact, reading, writing, speaking, listening supports their content area. It's not that we're asking them to teach kids how to read, but we're asking them to give students opportunities to think, discuss, write about their thinking, those kinds of things.
We're small, so I have 7 middle school teachers, and with that, we have a lot of flexibility. We've had our social studies and science teachers go into the classrooms of our ELA. They, during PLCs, they have worked to analyze student work from the ELA classrooms to see and for those teachers to model what they're looking for and what is exemplary work. And then we've actually gotten into this year some co-teaching, especially with our social studies teacher and our 8th grade ELA teacher, to where they're working together to do some student discussion strategies, to where the debates and different strategies that we've been working on to get the students into the discussion. So I feel like we've kind of hit that collaborative model as our approach to trying to, get the social studies and science teachers to see how to do it, because now I think they know why they need to do it. Now it's just giving them the tools to be able to do it.
Good.
Yeah,
very good.
Yeah, those are some great responses, Amanda. Thank you.
That was Carla.
No, that was Amanda. Carla's muted.
Oh, okay.
Carla, I did unmute you. Do you anything you want to share that you're finding from this?
We're doing some of the same things that the other ones are talking about, and especially having ELA teachers meet with social studies and science, and actually everyone in the building except for math. We haven't done very much with math. But again, they have their mathematical practices, again, to model and work with them on specific standards that they can incorporate in reading and writing into their classroom.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Amanda, sorry, I misnamed you. When we worked in your district with Striving Readers, one of the things that was helpful to students is when teachers across content areas were using similar literacy strategies, and the students started recognizing those and being able to call on them themselves to help them make sense of what they were reading or to help guide them in writing. And so the fact that you've got teachers working together in that way, and Carla, the same thing, that's excellent, because then the kids will see common kinds of approaches and it will make sense to them.
Eric, anything you want to share?
Like I said, we'll continue to work. We're continuing to work through our PLCs. And one of the things that we've implemented as far as the reading aspect goes, we've implemented eyes on text across our core curricular classes. It's something that has to be included on their lesson plans daily. It's something that we look for, something that we have on our walkthrough instruments. So we're constantly communicating with our teachers as far as the reading aspect goes.
Okay, thank you. I'm not familiar with that, but I will look that up. Thank you. That's another strategy. Again, as we can help teachers understand how to generalize across departments, that does support exactly what we've already been talking about with generalizability. So I want to point out to you as you begin to look at the content areas as we begin to shift. We got about 15 more minutes before we want to try to get you out of here, and we're not going to have an opportunity to take you all the way through the report. The high school report's about 60 pages. The middle school report's a svelte 40-something pages, so we don't have the time to do that. But I do want to point out some things. As you begin to look at the standards and the ACT college readiness charts, don't expect that you would see all standards addressed during a 15 to 20-minute walkthrough. That is not the goal. In fact, you would not want your teachers being that diverse and addressing so many things. The fact that the standards observed are not necessarily, all the standards in the chart is not necessarily a bad thing. You're looking at some specific things that we want to recognize. In math especially, because they tend to be discrete skills and concepts that are not necessarily tied together. Obviously, if somebody's working on data analysis, you're likely not to see any geometry, and that's okay. Depending on what time of the year we were in the classrooms, you would likely see specific algebra standards addressed or specific geometry standards addressed. So that is something that we don't want teachers to feel like, well, you know, I taught that, but I just didn't teach it that day. Don't feel like that needs to come out when you're looking at these ACT college readiness standards charts. It is an issue, though, if you look at the arrangement of standards. So if I'm looking at the reading standards and there are 5 or 6 observations or 4 observations, and none of the higher level standards were addressed during the 4 observations, that's where we begin to say, okay, this is a pattern that we think needs to be addressed. We should have seen some aspect of the higher level thinking addressed during during the 4 or 5 observations. Again, not putting any one teacher on the spot here. In math, where we want to look at the middle school especially, is that M11, the first section, numbers, operations, and basic operations and applications, is that first standard where they're talking about estimation. And really, are teachers building into their everyday instruction the opportunity for students to make sense and estimate the values they're working with? If the instruction is always just about finding the right answer and never about students making sense of the numbers they're working with, that's one of those areas that's a concern for us. And so as you begin to look at those analysis statements that are underneath the content charts, and I put math up there, and if you all know me, I'm an ex-math teacher, so I always think best through math. So that's the example I always put first. This page will look slightly different at the high school level because the standards are a lot bigger. But what we want to look at here, so when I say bigger, there's more standards, not that there are bigger standards, there's more of them. The analysis statements are triggered off of presence of indicators or not presence of indicators. So for instance, when we talk about that M11, if that standard was above a threshold of at least 10 to 15%, I don't remember what that threshold is off the top of my head, then it triggered a yes statement. Good. Your teachers are having your students do this routinely as part of their ongoing instruction. That's a major positive, and here are some next steps that you might think about. If it wasn't observed, there's some rationale why we would think this would be a good thing to observe. And again, as I just mentioned in math, that estimation is about sense making and students making sense in context to the learning that they're doing. Not learning estimation strategies separately, but as they solve other things, how do I flexibly estimate what a good answer might look like, what a good answer might be? Am I making, does the work I'm doing make sense? That kind of work is embedded. And so that's what those analysis statements that follow each of the content area charts is for. I also want to make sure I draw your attention to that, how to use the data and analysis statements with your departments. Those are some specific suggestions that we have for you to use those departments to really kind of help the teachers make sense of this. And again, this is not a, we got you. This is a continual development model. We recognize where we are, and there's a reason why big federal projects are not 3-year projects, that they're 5- and 6-year projects, because we know it takes a long time to develop these processes.
Also, as Roland is illustrating, this particular page, which as he said is repeated throughout the report is written from the perspective of school leadership. Mostly school administrators or teacher leaders or whoever is in a position to supervise instruction. And so when you look, for example, at that blue box, how to use, it's not written from a teacher perspective as much as what do you do as an administrator when you're in classes, when you're talking to teachers, when you're working on supervision kinds of activities. And so we really ask that you spend some time looking at those. They go throughout the whole report, not only for the ACT areas, but also for Common Core shifts, you'll see them.
And again, this is just more of what it looks like. The next one is science. Again, you'll see that red box. You'll see some if-then statements. And so we're kind of approaching that end where I wanted to kind of tie up. I would like you to go through and not look at all 4 content areas right now, and hopefully you've already done that. But what we want you to do before we come together on the 16th is to go through your report with a highlighter because and begin to identify those specific things that are making sense to you with the work that you know you already have in place. And Amanda, I'm going to use a couple of things that you said that you all are working on. So as you begin to go through that social studies and you say, well, we know we've already started to address this, highlight that section of standards maybe that might be missing in the social studies and say, what we're doing in this case is we've done some peer observations to help teachers make the connection between the strategies. We've done some co-teaching and to begin to highlight what are some of the things that you have already put in place to address these things. And then the next thing to think about is what's a question you still have about this? What's the next steps for how we continue to develop this? So as you begin looking at your social studies, does your map data confirm that you're beginning to make those progress? And again, that's a really quick turnaround from any kind of professional development in 1 year. We wouldn't expect to see a huge increase, but there might be some positive trends. So generating what are the things that you've already put in place, reading for some specificity as you begin to look at these departments, and what are some of the questions you still have in place as you go forward. Any questions about that? So Eric, I know that one of the things that you mentioned is that that idea of flexible timing, and I know your math department has a really unique model where they spend 2 days a week in the labs working on the independent benchmarking and really kind of making sure they get those standards. So it's really important for your math teachers to think about, well, when I do have those students together all in one place, how am I really maximizing their voice? We know that learning is social. How do we really help them make connections between the content they're learning independently and the content we're learning in the classroom, as well as making sense of all that content? That's a model that really puts an emphasis on student discourse in the mathematics classroom.
You know, something that we've also talked about going into next year is, you know, as we're using these, you know, the computer programs and individualization with those students is also providing the students maybe small group with the teachers, you know, students that are, you know, we do needs-based placement in our math department. And, you know, that would give the opportunity if a teacher can work with a group of 5 or a group of 6 that maybe even narrows it down even further and work with those students where they're at and some of the problems that they're having. One of the things that we emphasize, especially whenever I go into a classroom and do a walkthrough, is, you know, whenever you're going over the problems with students and you have to analyze that data and see where the breakdown is maybe in a math problem. You know, they may be able to understand step 1, step 2, but the breakdown might be in step 3, and it's got to be on the teacher to maybe, you know, have the kids walking through that and talking and get that communication going and see where the breakdown's actually at.
Right, and not telling them where the breakdown is, but having them explore that. So you made a couple of statements that I want to touch on. We actually worked with yes, we've worked with some hybrid algebra and the idea of having students work in that blended environment, and it is really tough on students to work independently. So I think that whole idea of having teachers identify small groups and do some mini lessons, some on-demand lessons. So maybe it's a day where they're in the lab and I'm pulling 2 or 3 together to really kind of have the students process how they did on this lesson, if they didn't do well, and where the areas are that they are in need of in order to address that individual standard. I think that's a really key critical piece. One of the things that students need is that specific feedback and the ability to process that information. Just getting it on the computer generally doesn't do it, and so that is a nice response to that model that you all have in place.
We did what Roland's referring to is we did a federal level research project on Algebra 1 in blended environments, And one of the takeaways from that was that there has to be a connection between what the teacher does in the regular class setting and what the students are doing in the computer lab. So, for example, if your teacher in that setting is monitoring what the kids are doing online, picking out patterns, and then coming back to the class, either whole class or in groups, and saying, okay, here's a common error, because really kids learn, and teachers do too, from the errors as much as from the correct doing of work. Targeting what are those errors, what are those common mistakes kids are making, and make sure that not only is the teacher helping them correct that so they don't keep practicing it incorrectly, but also to get the kids to explore, you know, where, as you said, Eric, where is the breakdown? At what point are they missing something, and how can they move beyond that? So that's great that your teachers are doing that. Encourage others to do that as well.
And I took the slide out, and that's why, if you all were looking at the screen and the PowerPoint was jumping all around, I need to put it back in because, Eric, the other thing that you said was having students kind of do analysis of the problem solving. So if you all can find your standards for mathematical practice slide, and again, in the math, it'll be in the math, in the high school, it'll be in the math section, that chart for standards for mathematical practice, because that's a really key piece of that higher level thinking in the math department is the analysis of problem solving. And if you look at the 4 standards for mathematical practice that we observed, the first one was problem solving and persevering in problem solving. And one of the things that students really struggle with, and this is a standard mathematics, a traditional way of teaching mathematics in America is the teacher steps in and kind of gives that process to students all too often, or they give routine problems, and that is the same process is used in solving a problem over and over again, and they get really good at recognizing it right then, but they're not able to generalize as they work across different kinds of things. So that whole idea of having them do the analysis of the problem-solving process themselves is really key. That also really supports persevering in problem-solving. They're beginning to think about the process, and it's not just about finding the answer, but it's about the process. That's a big shift for teachers. But that also then supports the other standard, one of the other standards for mathematical practice that we look for, and that is constructing viable arguments and critiquing the reasoning of others. If they're doing that analysis of the problem solving in small groups, and they're sharing how they solved it, and then as peers we're asking questions of each other, that's the really high-level exemplary practices that we're looking for in those standards for mathematical practice. Again, that's a pretty big shift, but I think all math, it's one that all math teachers are willing to buy into, because all math teachers will say they want their students to be better problem solvers. I don't think I've ever, in any of my work, ever come across a teacher who says, oh, I don't want my students to be good at problem solving. So that's an easy one for them to kind of make a focus, and that's a good beginning area because it ties into things that they're really interested in. Problem solving and having students talk about that process more effectively. So that's another area that we encourage you to explore. Yeah. So as you begin to look at this, you want to look at your narrative. And this is the overall summary and the individual content area summary. So I'd like you to take a look at that summary and share one thing that you find in that summary that either correlates with what you already knew or pushes your thinking.
So at the middle school, all those summaries are together. You'll see at the end of the report, you'll see overall. Are they in the high school at the very beginning?
Yeah, they're in the summary section in the high school. So if you go to the summary section of the high school, that's before the math, all the narrative is there. And in the middle school, all the narrative is closer to the end of the report. And again, what we're looking for is one thing that either correlates with what you already know or pushes your thinking.
These are 6, 8, 10 pages.
So we'll give you about 3 minutes to look at that, and then we'll do our last share out. I know that's not enough time, but So you've got about 30 seconds. If you want to type in the chat, we can go from there, or you can, we'll unmute you. We'll leave that up to you all how you want to do this last share out. One thing that either kind of correlates with what you already knew, or one thing that's really kind of pushing your thinking still. And again, I know for the middle schools, your reports came out last year, but 1 year it's hard to address everything. Okay, so in an effort to keep us on time, go ahead, Amanda.
Okay, one of the biggest things that jumped out at us as the leadership team looked at this report and the walkthrough findings was the lack of rigor and relevance across all contents in all classrooms. And so early in the year, the content teams developed 2 to 3 goals that they wanted to anchor themselves on for the year that would help address that issue. And so all year long we've worked around that. One of the big things that we did was start with our assessments so that we could work backwards. And so we've along the way been analyzing our assessments and have realized and faced the reality that they are not, that they weren't, we weren't assessing at a rigorous level. And so that match to the standards wasn't there. So starting with that and then working backwards into our classroom level instruction has been our approach this year. For math, we've hit kind of what you were talking about, Roland. We have, as a 3rd through 8th math team, we identified common thinking strategies is what we've called them. And so every math classroom has anchor charts, and the kids are keeping tally marks and having to reflect around what thinking strategy they're using, which is basically just a problem-solving strategy in math. But kind of developing that common understanding among the teachers so that then we can have those common thinking skills delivered down to our kids to help them think beyond one way or just basic recall. So every team has kind of set their goals, and we've really tried to anchor ourselves around the evidence from the walkthrough and many other pieces of data that showed that we just didn't have the rigor we need.
Very good.
Yeah, very, very.
That's great.
Yeah, yeah. That's a. I think that whole idea of thinking about rigor's not there. This is just one piece of that, and like as you said towards the end of your comment there's a lot of other pieces that are probably pointing you in that direction. And then if that is something that you finally are willing to acknowledge, beginning to explore it, and you're right. If the assessments don't get to the level of rigor that you need, then the instruction won't. So that's a textbook and a very strong approach to resolving that problem. Thanks, Amanda. Carl, I'm going to unmute you.
Okay, well, we saw one of the things early on this year is that we were giving writing assignments without giving rubrics, and we knew that was a problem, so we worked on that. And that was also cited in your report. And then another thing is a challenge for us is for us to develop rigorous lessons where students are engaged in dialogue, the thinking process, application of skills. And I just think teachers are somewhat uncomfortable with that because they feel like they've kind of gotten results with more teacher-directed, some of the other things, and it's just an uncomfortable phase that we're trying to go through, and so we'll continue our work with that also. But staying very tight to the standards, we worked on that this year. So I think we have that part. It's just trying to get them where we have more rigorous lessons for students.
Thanks, Carla. Great responses. Again, I'm sorry I got to mute you. That whole idea of writing assignments without rubrics, and again, that's something you all have already identified, but that was confirmed. So thinking about that's one piece then that we know we want to address. And if you look at the research, Cheryl Gray's research on rigor, that whole idea of rubrics as a central component for assessment is nothing new. And the stronger you can make those rubrics, that really also does develop peer discussion, self-analysis of that, and as you begin to think about what that looks like in your role at the 6th grade at the elementary schools, and then the progression into the middle school and progression in the high school, that's a nice way of vertically aligning that kind of curriculum. And that's one small piece, but when you begin to think about it from your role of bringing those 3 schools together for a common level set of approaches, that becomes a very, not daunting, but a very significant task to undertake, one that takes a little bit of planning and think about what the rollout is, the development, the vertical alignment of expectations. So that's a great response. Thank you.
And that's also work that we do with Gear Up Schools, so if that's something you need help with, let us know. Eric, what about you?
Once again, we, we're on that rigorous highway, I guess, as we're going down. We got to increase our rigor in our classrooms. By doing that, we're developing a PDSA for our lesson plans, where the teachers are going into their PLCs and taking the backwards approach, doing the assessments first, determine what the kids need to know, and then developing the activities. Now, what we're going to be doing in our PLCs is looking at the data, analyzing the data, and then utilizing that data to drive our lesson plans. I think a lot of times we look at the data, know what the data is, but I don't think that it necessarily maybe drives our lesson plans. So we're going to have them really analyze that data, determine what the kids need in that classroom, and then develop the activities and lessons that they need particularly, and do those on a 2 to 3 week cycle. What we're going to have, we have a couple teachers that teaches biology and a couple teachers that teach English too. We're going to break those PLCs. They're going to be in the same room, but they're going to be working together to develop those lesson plans. We're not taking necessarily their creativity in their own classrooms, but they're collaborating to see what activities may work, where those kids are at that particular level, and what activity is best to use based off of the data. Like you said, from this walkthrough, we've had 2 Elliott walkthroughs this year too, so that we can look at that as well. Plus all the K-Prep data, the EOC data, and all those type things to help drive those lessons.
Yeah, I think that's great. You've identified one of the gaps that we and others see in schools, is that schools spend a lot of time looking at data, but they don't necessarily tie it to the design of lessons and units. So that's that missing piece. So it's good that you've identified that. I encourage you to, if you haven't already, is to look at those narrative reports in depth. In 2012, we provided an overall project synopsis of what we saw. This time, every school has anywhere from 6 to 10 pages of in-depth observations and suggestions, ties to PGES, ties to rigor relevance, depth of knowledge charts, all those connections to try to give you something to work with. And so, we hope that you'll study it, use it with your faculty, and see it as a guide and a tool that will help you on the strategies that you're already doing, and maybe giving you some other ideas as well. Roland, we're right at the end. So you have some things you want to summarize?
Right. So exactly what Deborah just said. Read through the report a little bit more carefully and use that highlighting. I really encourage you to think about having whoever is going to be attending, if it's the counselor, teacher leaders, district level leaders, to do the same thing independently. They should read through this report and highlight not a numerous number of things, but what they think, 2 or 3 things in each content area that they think are the critical pieces from the report. And again, this is one piece of data. If it's something you kind of notice, but it's also something that correlates with what you all already know from your other walkthroughs, then that should become a highlighted star. This is an area that we know we need to work on. Begin to think about what are the approaches to addressing this that you already have in place. And Amanda and Carla and Eric, all 3 of you have already highlighted a lot of reactions to this. And so one of the things that the sustainability plan is designed for is not for Gear Up Kentucky, but it's to help you all think about what are all the pieces we already have in place and how do we help address them. One thing that we didn't discuss, Eric, was your concern about how we begin to think about implementing the other Gear Up stuff long term. that is something we will address at the sustainability plan, but we didn't have time to address that today. But that's a great need to know that I don't want to lose track of, and want you to know that we are aware of that, but that was not something we can possibly get to today. But I am happy to discuss that with you if you want to more in-depthly.
And remember, this report also has EPAS scores, it has end-of-course exam scores, it has K-PREP data, as kind of a model for you all to use with whatever other, if you use MAP or whatever other kinds of tests you have, to try to start pulling it together and saying, here's the quantitative data based on observations, here's more quantitative data based on assessments, and then here's qualitative data. We gave you our take in the narrative report. You probably have your own notes from walkthroughs you do. Starting putting all those together and then using those as the basis of refining your sustainability plan next week. That's what we're hoping for.
Yeah. And so one of the things that we want you also to think about is brainstorming questions that can be addressed as part of this process. We know that coming up with solutions oftentimes is a closed-ended piece because the solution's owned by one person and not necessarily a great way of developing outside-of-the-box thinking. So if you can work with your team to think about what are some of the questions that we need to be answering as we do this, and so why did our social studies dip? What can we do about it? What are some of those bigger questions we can begin to address? That oftentimes opens up the opportunity for teams to develop a solution together that addresses the bigger question rather than one short-term solution. So thinking about, as you all read through this, identify some of the important key pieces, identify what you're already doing, and think about what are some of the questions that this is raising for you. And then we'll see you on the 16th. Any questions from you all before we sign off? Carla, you're unmuted.
I think we're good. We'll see you on the 16th.
All right, thanks, Carla.
Thank you all for participating.
Thank you.